all of us, I extend my particular solidarity and love to all the Jews in the audience and any minorities in the audience. When I do E.B. White, I always take the few weeks beforehand. I've done this talk in many libraries. I think I've hit all 9, not with the E.B. White talk, but and I reread essays in light of the events. And I came across this beautiful piece that I want to read to you before I begin. It's from The New Yorker. It's during the war. It's from the book White Flags, which is his collection of essays he wrote for The New Yorker during the war, World War II. This is dated December 30th, 1944. Last week, when things were at a low point in Europe, we sat reading the paper, trying to figure out who was going to win. Just a nervous little homebody in a sack suit trying to unravel supply lines, spearheads, flank movements, reinforcements, armor, weather, and the whole impossible mystery of modern tactical warfare. We got mired, as any civilian does, but in the middle of this imbecile business, our eye went over to a photograph, to an inside page of the paper, and something about the picture stopped us cold. It showed a couple of Yanks straightening up the inside of a synagogue in Holland, which had been desecrated by Germans on an earlier visit. Here was the thing that was a way of getting forgotten. This was the thing that has a way of getting forgotten in the middle of a war. And we were reminded rather sharply that there is an idea that travels with Allied armor, and that it is neither a new idea nor one about which any American soldier or civilian need feel the slightest misgivings. Anyone who isn't sure who is going to win, those who would liberate the spirit or those who would calcify it, had better quit fiddling with newspapers and armies. There is much at the moment to indicate that 1945 will be a happy year, but for those who fight along with this main idea, whether in the glint of battle or in the uneasy chair of civil life, the year is already clothed in a certain historical radiance, like that of stars of the first magnitude. That's for my friends in Squirrel Hill, and for all of us. I lived in Squirrel Hill 5 years, and it really hit home to me, this horrible massacre. I went to a panel on anti-Semitism at Dartmouth. Susanna Heschel was one of the speakers. If you ever get a chance to hear her run and to hear her, she's Abraham Heschel's daughter, the great rabbi. And one of my students asked her, the room was packed with mostly community people, but some of my students, and one of my students said that he had been asked by another student, or he'd been in a conversation with another student after this horrible Pittsburgh incident and the Kentucky, etc. And this student had said that he was a minority student. He said that his oppression was worse than the oppression of anti-Semitism. And my student was asking Susanna and the other members of the panel, including the president of Dartmouth, how to answer that. He didn't know how to answer it. He knew there was something very wrong about what the student had said, but he didn't know how to answer it. And another member of the Jewish Studies program, Irene Kincaid, said, just grabbed the microphone and spoke so eloquently about how we must not compare oppressions, but at the same time need to understand each hatred in its particularity. And I just carry that message to you, and also because E.B. White said it over and over again in many different ways in the essay, and we'll be visiting those. So, glad to be here. Thank you, Cindy, very much for organizing this. The weather kept me away last spring, I think twice, was it? We had to cancel. I was worried Cindy was going to give up on me, but she didn't. Thank you to Allie White, of course, who makes all things possible, and especially to Allie White because she's the one that called me up a few years ago and said, why don't you give a talk for First Wednesdays on E.B. White, on his essays? And I said, do I want to confess this on TV? I don't know. I said, I really don't know his essays. And she said, oh, you have a treat. Go read them and get back to me. And so she gave me E.B. White. What a gift. The first time I gave this talk was in St. Johnsbury, and the wonderful librarian there introduced me as about to give a talk on Charlotte's Web. And I got up and I said, well, no, it's not really about Charlotte's Web. She said, oh, well, mostly it'll be about Charlotte's Web. No, not really, it won't be. But we'll weave Charlotte's Web in, and thank you for your personal story about that. It's lovely. It's an extraordinary book for many reasons, many, many reasons. I'm here tonight really to convince you to read his essays. And if you want to start with one book, I would recommend One Man's Meat, which is the series of essays that he wrote for Harper's. But in any case, all of them. So while if I speak on Emily Dickinson, I unpack it and do a lot of talking because who can understand Emily Dickinson? E.B. White is so clear and available. There's no unpacking him. He's just right there. So unlike many of my other talks, which I hope you invite me back to do, Rachel Carson is a talk I told Cindy I'm dying to give here. This will be an evening with E.B. White. A little more so than an evening with Nancy Crumbine. I'll be doing more reading of him than I usually do. My main message is to read E.B. White. I'm going to begin with one reading from written on my birthday, October 18th, 1956, and it gives you a flavor for his writing style. One of the things that's so dramatic about these essays, and then I'm going to just do one short reading, and then I'm going to do a chronology of his life, the 60 years he was at the New Yorker, etc., and then go back to readings under certain categories. There'll be more about the politics relevant to our present day situation. But this first one I absolutely love, not only because it was written on my birthday, because it combines this gorgeous ability of his to talk about very difficult things in a light way. Emily Dickinson said, tell the truth, but tell it slant, right? Because we can't take the truth full on. And we're dealing with a lot of things like climate change that nobody wants to talk about because it's all bad news. But he talks about it. He talks about pollution in a way that you want to keep reading. And so he does it in this piece, and it just is such a good example of how he's able to do it. So one thing you have to, does everybody know strontium-90? Are we all old enough to remember what that was? The radioactive fallout from the nuclear testing, which was happening, of course, in the 50s. The word came into the vocabulary between 50 and 55. This was written in Turtle Bay, October 18th, 1956. This is a dark morning in the apartment, but the block is gay with yellow moving vans disgorging Mary Martin's belongings in front of a house a couple of doors east of here, into which, I should say from the looks of things, she is moving. Notice the sentence structure is so gorgeous. People's lives are so exposed at moments like this. Their possessions lying naked in the street. The light of day searching out every bruise and mark of indoor living. It is an unfair expose. End tables with nothing to be at the end of. Standing lamps with their cords tied up in curls. Bottles of vermouth craning their long necks from cartons of personal papers. And every wastebasket carrying its small cargo of miscellany. The vans cause a stir in the block. Heads appear in the windows of number 230 across the way. Passers-by stop on the sidewalk and stare brazenly into the new home through the open door. I have a mezzanine seat for the performance. Like a peeping Tom, I lounge here in my bathrobe and look down, held in the embrace of a common cold before which scientists stand in awe, although they have managed to split the atom, infect the topsoil with strontium-90, break the barrier of sound, and build the Lincoln Tunnel. I'm going to read that last sentence again. I have a mezzanine seat for the performance, semicolon. Like a peeping Tom, I lounge here in my bathrobe and look down, held in the embrace of a common cold before which scientists stand in awe, although they have managed to split the atom, infect the topsoil with strontium-90, break the barrier of sound, and build the Lincoln Tunnel. That's one sentence. Oh dear. He was the last of 6 kids, 6 children, youngest, this big gap before he came along, in a lovely house in Mount Vernon, New York, well-to-do family, lovely lot. He loved, they were still horse and buggy, so there was a carriage house. Played outside a lot, loved animals. You all know all about that, probably. His first publishing experience was an experience shared by other very famous, other youngsters who became famous in the St. Nicholas magazine. Have any of you heard of this? It was there was a nature-centered movement in the end of the 19th or early 20th century. And Rachel Carson's mother was very involved in it. And it published this magazine and published young writers of prose and poems. And among the famous writers that were published in this publication, E.B. White, Mary Dodge of Hans Brinker, Louise May Alcott, Rachel Carson, William Faulkner, Bennett Cerf, Kay Boyle, who, by the way, is a much better writer than Hemingway, same period, Edmund Wilson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Stephen Benet, Robert Benchley, do you remember him? Hilarious. Vita Saxville West, Celia Thaxter of Star Island fame and Appledore, the Isle of Shoals, and Catherine Sargent. A friend of mine gave me a leather-bound copy of St. Nicholas, and I shouldn't have even told you because I forgot to bring it, but if you're ever in Norwich, Hanover area, stop by, I'll show it to you. E.B. White went to Cornell, where he was nicknamed Andy, and was called Andy the rest of his life. He was at Cornell from 1917 to 1921. This is where he met Professor Strunk, as in Strunk and White, The Elements of Style, which is his most famous book. I trust you've all read it. If you haven't read it recently, reread the chapter that White wrote called Approaches to Style. It's about 3/4 of the way through the book. It's a required reading for all my students. It's absolutely brilliant. And another professor had a huge influence on him there, Professor Burr, a historian, and it was there that he said this professor changed his life by introducing him to the notion of freedom through the study of history. Profound effect. I also have to share with you that he got a D in freshman English. And I confess, I just discovered this from a legitimate biographer, so I trust it's true, but I'm now going to have to tell my students this. I think it will inspire them, but it might not. I don't know. Michael Jordan was kicked off his first basketball team, so it's in that range. After Cornell, he went, much to his parents' dismay, he announced it the day before he left, he took off in a Model T and drove with a friend across the country. Can you imagine going across the country in a Model T? He then got a job as a journalist in Seattle and then hopped on a boat to go to Alaska. He ran out of money, so he had a sort of decent room. It wasn't first class, but it was somewhere up there. And he ran out of money, and they were kicking him off the boat. And he said, well, can't I do anything? Well, sure, you can go down and kick coal into you can be a fire stoker. And then they didn't know what room to put him in, though. Anyway, he ended up serving tables to the people he had been hobnobbing with as equals, and they were very upset about it and confused. It's hilarious, his description of it. This is in Alaska, the SS Buford he was on, all the way to seaward. In 1925, he's back in New York looking for a job. He publishes a few things in random places, and Catherine, then Angell, I've been pronouncing it Angell, but it is Angell, correct? Yes, because I was corrected by a family member the last time I gave this talk. Are there any family members here? I said that once and the audience laughed, and I said, no, it's true. In Norwich, there were about three of the family members there. Catherine Angell, taken by him, wrote him a letter, and we have these letters. They're in these. But by the way, I brought a lot of E.B. White books for you to look at. There are wonderful photos in there. She wrote him, pleading with him to write for the New Yorker. And eventually, he finally agreed to do that. And there, as I said, he ended up staying for 60 years and marrying Catherine and having one son with her, Joel, who had two children who are now running a boat school in Brookline, Maine. And I had the privilege of renting a cottage up there a few years ago to snoop around. And the house, by the way, his famous farm is preserved. He didn't want it sold to a franchise, so it would be Charlotte's Cafe or some god-awful thing. So he specified in his will that it be privately sold, but the people who bought it have kept it up beautifully. There are a lot of no trespassing signs, but you can see it from the road, and I walked back and forth in front of it about 20 times taking pictures. But you can see the bay. It's just absolutely gorgeous. I'm getting ahead of myself. So they did start going up to Maine and bought this house in Brookline. And eventually, E.B. White said, we just have to move up there. And they moved up there they bought the farm in 31 and moved up in 38. When the war began, and Harold Ross, who was the chief editor of the New Yorker, founder and editor of the New Yorker, really along with Catherine, they worked together. She's an amazing woman. I keep telling Allie I want to give a talk just on Catherine. Ross begged them to come back to New York because he couldn't get enough help to work. So they did come back to New York, but then back to Maine, back and forth for quite a few years. But from 42 to 45, they were back in New York. Let's see. So Stuart Little was his first children's book, along with these essays. He got an honorary degree from Dartmouth in 1948, and he wrote a hilarious letter about getting the hood all confused on his head after he had been. It goes on and on about this. I didn't think you were close enough to Dartmouth for me to read the letter itself, but it's fun. How many of you have read his wonderful essay, Here is New York, 1949? Now it's a little book, thin little book, but beautiful. Charlotte's Web in 52, Elements of Style, 59. Trumpet of the Swan. How many of you have read that? It's the third children's book that not as well known, absolutely beautiful. The detail in that book about swans, he did this fabulous research on all the animals that he wrote about. He delayed the publication of Charlotte's Web for a year to do more research on the particular kind of spider that she was. And so with the trumpeter swans, his research was meticulous, and that he could. I loved what you said about his big words, because he writes very often about how. And Catherine felt the same way. She was an editor of children's books, how important it was that we write for children, not in any condescending way, but as equals. And he does that by virtue of the first opening line of Charlotte's Web. How many of you remember the opening line of Charlotte's Web? Go ahead. What is it?
Where's Papa going with that axe?
Excellent. What a way to open a children's book, right? Where is Papa going with that axe? And it goes on, you know, it just immediately puts you into the middle of this the drama of farm life and the issue of death, which is what this book is about. It's just shocking. And of course, lots of people wanted it banned, and Stuart Little, of course, they wanted to be banned because Stuart was born of woman. And Harold Ross famously came into E.B. White's office after this thing got really popular, and when it was finally accepted for publication. He said, "You just made one mistake. You should have had Stuart just arriving." And in fact, later editions, he did finally give in to that. But at first, he really resisted it. He said, "No, I want him to." Presidential Medal of Honor awarded to E.B. White in 1963 by, of course, John F. Kennedy. He won the Pulitzer in 1978, and what's unique about this is that he won it for no one particular book. The Pulitzer is always given for one book. So E.B. White was just so much deserving, but it was for all of his work. He died in October 1st, 1985, and he's buried in Brookline with, I'm going to mispronounce it. Is it Brooklyn? Yeah, why am I saying Brookline? Okay, Brooklyn, thank you. Next to Catherine, across the street from the church where they very rarely attended, although the times that they did attend was quite interesting. And I was able to visit the church. I spent some time just sitting in the empty church and sitting by the graves. It's a beautiful little town and very unspoiled. How many of you have been there? Yeah. Beautiful. So that's my little summary of his life. We can get back to that in the question and answer period. I'd like to read you now some excerpts, again, just to whet your appetite for this incredible man. And I'm going to start with some political readings. And well, I was going to read you on, I'm going to save that for later. Okay. Sorry, yeah? October 1938. Let's go back just to review history. Any high school students here? Gives me an excuse to review history for all of you, right? How much do we remember? The Munich Agreement, does everybody know what that was? Chamberlain, ring a bell? The settlement permitting Nazi Germany to annex portions of Czechoslovakia. And it was the great appeasement, the attempt to appease Hitler, which of course didn't work because a year later he rolled his tanks into Poland. And Chamberlain has forever been, he didn't go down well in history because of this moment. I want to read you, this was from the New Yorker, October 1938. Long before the coming of the cold, I was on the barn roof, laying clear cedar shingles 5 inches to the weather. My neighbors' roofs all showed signs of activity, so I built some staging and mounted my own beanstalk to see what I could see. It seems a long while ago that I was up there, hanging on by the seat of my pants, those clear days at the edge of frost, with a view of pasture, woods, sea, hills, and my pumpkin patch stretched out below in serene abundance. I stayed on the barn, steadily laying shingles, all during the days when Mr. Chamberlain, Mr. Daladier, the El Duce, and the Fuhrer were arranging their horse trade. It seemed a queer place to be during a world crisis. an odd thing to be doing. There was no particular reason for making my roof tight, as the barn contained nothing but a croquet set, some swallows' nests, and a stuffed moose head. That's white to just quintessential white. Goes from the Führer to the stuffed moose head in one sentence. In my trance-like condition, waiting for the negotiations to end, I added a cupola to the roof to hold a vane that would show which way the wind blew. In some respects, though, a barn is the best place anybody could pick for sitting out a dance with a prime minister and a demagogue. There is a certain clarity on a high roof, a singleness of design in the orderly work of laying shingles, snapping the chalk line, laying the butts to the line, picking the proper width shingle to give an adequate lap. One's perspective at that altitude is unusually good. Who has the longer view of things anyway? A prime minister in a closet or a man on a barn roof? I'm down now. The barn is tight and the peace is preserved. It is the ugliest piece the earth has ever received for a Christmas present. Old England eating swastika for breakfast instead of kipper is a sight I had as lief not lived to see. And though I'm no warrior, I would gladly fight for the things Nazism seeks to destroy. And though I am no warrior, I would gladly fight for the things Nazism seeks to destroy. And then September 1939, again, September 1st, 1939, the tanks rolled into Poland, and 2 days later, England and France declared war on Germany. This is his column in the New Yorker, September 1939. War comes to each of us in his own fashion. Early on that Sunday, when England and France finally lost their patience, wishing to put my affairs in order, I cleaned my comb and brush, pouring a few drops of household ammonia into the bowl of water. Notice the detail here. Running the comb through the brush, then brushing the comb with a nail brush. So when I read these, I think about what if my freshman writers handed me this, would I say, what's a comb and brush in there for? I probably would say such a stupid thing. And then I'd say, well, you're not E.B. White. But it's so brilliant how he does this. I mean, how else to describe? Let me go on, sorry. Well, I'm not really sorry. At breakfast, there was a house guest in a bathrobe. She approached the war intellectually through Versailles. The historians in the room will get that, but don't ask me to explain it. After breakfast, I went to the garage and sorted some nails. Putting the clabbered nails together in a bunch, the 6-penny nails together, the boarding nails together in cans. The blade of my jackknife being stiff, I eased it with a few drops of penetrating oil. We decided we would go to church, a solemn place for a solemn hour. And again, just to remind you, they never went to church. The preparation was hurried, as though we were organizing a picnic on the spur of the moment. Church is at 10:30 here. The little boy was in tears about having to wear the blue suit, yet wanting to go. That's Joel. I wore a hat I found in a closet. The minister, a young fellow I recently sold some old hens to for $1 apiece, said he believed the meek would inherit the earth. We sang, "Am I a soldier of the cross? Are there no foes for me to fight?" The shopkeeper passed the plate. When we got back home, I went out to the barn to fix some chum bait, and somebody came out after a while and announced, "Dinner and the king." The words came with painful slowness as we all sat and chewed. Thus began the Second War for Democracy. I hope you've all seen the movie The King's Speech. If not, take a note and make sure you see it. I want to say another word about World War II while I'm at it. Have you read Lynn Olson's work? She's a historian, but she writes like a novelist. She's written Citizens of London and Those Angry Days. Anybody? Cindy, we gotta get this. Where are you? We gotta get this. She's a fabulous writer, and these books are amazing. And one of the Citizens of London are about the Americans in London, Edward R. Murrow and the ambassadors trying to get Roosevelt to wake up that if he doesn't do something, if he doesn't enter the war, England was going down, which it definitely was, as you know. And then Those Angry Days is a book about the isolationist movement, led by Charles Lindbergh, who was problematic, and it was America First. Do you remember this connection? This is all, I'm not talking in the past here. From the beginning, I'm in the present, I'm in today. The connections I hope you're making. Lindbergh was head of this movement called America First, which was, of course, echoed by Trump during his campaign, which was not to get into the war, and the Nazis weren't so bad, really. Poor Anne Murrow Lindbergh suffered from this. Her family was definitely in favor of getting into the war, and so she was caught between her husband and her family. But she, as a dutiful wife in those days, of the 40s, she wrote a book called The Waves of the Future, in which she supported her husband's position. And E.B. White critiqued it in one of his essays. I won't read it to you, but it's a beautiful, very, very definite critique, but as gentle as he could be with this wonderful writer whom he respected, but deeply disrespected this particular work of hers. A little more history. 1947. Do you all remember the McCarthy and the McCarthy hearings, the HUAC, House on Un-American Activities Committee? Needing to do the loyalty oath in order to keep your job. You remember some of that? Anyone have to do that? Do you remember anyone as old as I am? I'm not that old, actually. I wasn't working in 47, but E.B. White was really very, very upset about this, and he wrote in his column. This is November 29th, 1947, New York. This was a letter to the New York Herald Tribune. Again, note the humor and the very serious punch of it. To the New York Herald Tribune, I am a member of a party of one, and I live in an age of fear. Nothing lately has unsettled my party, his party of one, my party, and raised my fears so much as your editorial on Thanksgiving Day suggesting that employees should be required to state their beliefs in order to hold their jobs. The idea is inconsistent with our constitutional theory and has been stubbornly opposed by watchful men since the early days of the Republic. It's hard for me to believe that the Herald Tribune is backing away from the fight, and I can only assume that your editorial writer, in a hurry to get home for Thanksgiving, tripped over the First Amendment and thought it was his cat. The investigation of alleged communists by the Thomas Committee has been a confusing spectacle for all of us. I believe its implications are widely misunderstood and that the outcome is grave beyond exaggeration, beyond exaggerating. The essence of our political theory in this country is that a man's conscience shall be a private, not a public affair, and that only his deeds and words shall be open to survey, censure, and to punishment. The idea is a decent one, and it works. And then a little further down, I think security in critical times takes care of itself if the people and the institutions take care of themselves. First in line is the press. Security for me took a tumble, not when I read that there were communists in Hollywood, but when I read your editorial in praise of loyalty testing and thought control. If a man is in health, he doesn't need to take anybody else's temperature to know where he is going. If a newspaper or motion picture company is in health, he can get rid of communists and spies simply by reading proof and by watching previews. And then he goes on a little further. Your editorialists said he hoped the companies, in checking for loyalty, would use their powers sparingly and wisely. That is a wishful idea. One need only watch totalitarians at work to see that once men gain power over other men's minds, that power is never used sparingly and wisely, but lavishly and brutally and with unspeakable results. If I must declare today that I am not a communist, tomorrow I shall have to testify, and this is my favorite line. I'll start again, the sentence again. If I must declare today that I am not a communist, tomorrow I shall have to testify that I'm not a Unitarian. And the day after that I never belonged to a Dahlia Club. It is not a crime to believe anything at all in America. I'm going to repeat that. It is not a crime to believe anything at all in America. To date, it has not been declared illegal to belong to the Communist Party. Yet 10 men have been convicted not of wrongdoing, but of wrong believing. That is news in this country, and if I have not misread history, it is bad news. It's just stunning how timely this writing is. When you all read, as you will, when you all read his essay, you're going to just be blown away how timely this is. Let me go back to White Flag, from which I quoted initially. He has two definite. This was written August 7th, 1943, again for the New Yorker. I'm not quoting the whole thing, but this is a piece of it in which he defines fascism. There is a certain quality in fascism which is quite close to a certain quality in nationalism. Fascism is openly against people in general, in favor of people in particular. Nationalism, although in theory not dedicated to such an idea, actually works against people in general because of its preoccupation with people in particular. How brilliant is that? It reminds one of fascism also in its determination, nationalism reminds one of fascism also in its determination to stabilize its own position by whatever haphazard means present themselves, by treaties, policies, balances, agreements, pacts, and the jockeying for position which is summed up in the term diplomacy. This does not make an American firster, in other words, a member of the American First movement. This does not make an American firster a fascist. It simply makes him, in our opinion, a man who hasn't grown into his pants yet. The persons who have written most persuasively against nationalism are the young soldiers who have got far enough from our shores to see the amazing implications of a planet. Once you see it, you never forget it. Oh, okay, one more thing from White Flag. This is one of the funniest pieces to my mind, that he's written. January 26, 1946. So the war's over, and the UN is trying to get itself together, with Eleanor Roosevelt's help, of course. At their earliest convenience, and E.B. White was very excited about the UN, very supportive of it, obviously, as from what I've already read. At their earliest convenience, the delegates to the United Nations organization should form an orchestra. There must be, among those 700 men and women, enough fiddlers, flautists, cellists, trombonists, and drummers to make up a sizable band. And if the delegates were to organize one and perform together, the effect on the world would be incalculable. Eleanor Roosevelt could learn the triangle. Once a week, all deliberations, all matters of state should be put aside and the public invited to the assembly hall to hear the rarest of sounds, the concord of nations. Next morning, the papers, instead of carrying the latest installment in the long, uneasy story of international dissension, could report that the second movement had never been more solidly handled by and that Wyszynski turned in a masterful performance on the glockenspiel. There is, in fact, great need that the UN delegates find some human activity or pastime which will illustrate people's ability to lose themselves in a universal theme, to harmonize and to create beauty by following a single score rather than 51 separate scores. And it goes on. And how reminiscent, how connected this is to the Vermont Humanities Council's beautiful statement. E.B. White loved dogs, especially dachshunds. And how many of you have read some of his essays? I asked about White Flag, but remember Fred? His most beloved. He loved all his dogs, but Fred was his most beloved dog. I have to give you a little background on this reading. This is from Bedfellows, again, New Yorker essays. Dean Acheson was Secretary of State under Truman from 49 to 53, played a central role in defining American foreign policy during the Cold War. Everybody knows who Louis Brandeis was? The most distinguished Supreme Court justice we've ever had. Wilson, in 1916, nominated Brandeis to become member of the Supreme Court. His nomination was bitterly contested, partly because, as William O. Douglas wrote, quote, Brandeis was a militant crusader for social justice, whoever his opponent might be. He was dangerous not only because of his brilliance, his arithmetic, his courage. He was dangerous because he was incorruptible. And the fears of the establishment were greater because Brandeis was the first Jew to be named to the court. He was eventually confirmed. 21 Republican senators and 1 Democrat senator voted against his nomination, but he was confirmed, became one of the most famous and influential figures in the High Court. So I will read this section. So this is, E.B. White's in bed with his dachshund Fred next to him. I just saw an eagle go by, he would say. That's Fred. I just saw an eagle go by, he would say. It was carrying a baby. This was not precisely a lie. Fred was like a child in many ways and sought always to blow things up to proportions that satisfied his imagination and his love of adventure. He was a Cecil B. DeMille of dogs. He was a zealot, and I have just been reminded of him by a quote from one of the Democrats sharing my bed, Acheson quoting Brandeis. E.B. White talks about their bed with Catherine, always full of books and papers. They were always working in bed, editing and stuff. Sharing my bed, Acheson quoting Brandeis, quote, the greatest dangers to liberty, said Brandeis, lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning but without understanding, unquote. Fred saw in every bird, every squirrel, every housefly, every rat, every skunk, every porcupine a security risk and a present danger to his republic. He had a dossier on almost every living creature, as well as on several inanimate objects, including my son's football. And he goes on like this at some length, weaving between Fred and Atchison and Brandeis. Then I'm going to skip quite a lot here, and he goes on. The loyalty theme also relates to Fred, who presses ever more heavily against me this morning. Fred was intensely loyal to himself, as every strong individualist must be. He held unshakable convictions like Harry Truman. He was absolutely sure that he was in possession of the truth. Because he was loyal to himself, I found his eccentricities supportable. Actually, he contributed greatly to the general health and security of the household. Nothing has been quite the same since he departed. His views were largely of a dissenting nature, yet in tearing us apart, he somehow held us together. In obstructing, he strengthened us. In criticizing, he informed. This isn't just about the dog, right? In his rich, aromatic heresy, he nourished our faith. He was also a plain damn nuisance. I must not forget that. And then he goes on about Eisenhower calling for prayers in the schools, etc. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. How are we doing? Oh, I can't tell the time. What time is it? Does anyone know? It's 8 o'clock? Oh, well, 7 o'clock somewhere. Okay. In California, they're trying to do away with the time change. I don't think it's going to work, but. So how about the felons can vote in Florida? Yay! Unbelievable. 1.5 million people paid their dues, can't vote. Anyway, they can now, so that's good. Now, that's all related. Don't think it isn't. It's 8 o'clock, and I really want to have question and answers. Let me just say a word about E.B. White's two favorite authors. Thoreau, of course, it was the only book he owned, he said. It was Walden. And he writes about it beautifully. He has an essay where he takes Thoreau to Walden, and they talk. And he talks about the book Walden as an impossible book. It's the most, John Updike said, it's the most owned book in America next to the Bible, and it's even less read than the Bible, which is the most, yeah. And also he revered Rachel Carson. And so Rachel Carson wrote, there's so much to say about Rachel Carson. Please put it on your evaluation to invite me back so I can talk about Rachel Carson. But she wrote, when she knew about the DDT killing everything for a long time, she wrote E.B. White and asked him to write the book. And he wisely wrote her back and said, Rachel, I think you should write the book. She was already diagnosed with cancer and dying all the way through the writing of Silent Spring. But sorry, that's another lecture. But their closeness, their letters are back and forth, and with Catherine as well. It's very powerful connection there. Also, Elizabeth Bishop wrote for the New Yorker and was letters back and forth between Catherine and Elizabeth Bishop. So these, I love it when my friends come together, and these are four of my best friends: E.B. White, Elizabeth Bishop, Thoreau, and Carson. Okay, let me wind up. I just do have to read you one last thing, and then we're going to open it for questions. And this is from his essay, Intimidations, and I always reach for the wrong book. And again, apropos of where we are today. December 1941. A light fall of snow in the night, and this morning the fields look like a man's face when he has used too much powder after a shave. A few little apples still cling to one of the old trees. They catch the light and perform a frosted miracle of ornamentation. The sheep move about restlessly, finding little to satisfy them on the hard earth. How quickly life's accents shifted on that sudden and unforgettable Sunday, the fateful 7th of December. The bombing of, yeah, you know that, right? December 1941. Then I'm going to skip down. You must read the whole thing, but skipping some. The passionate love of, so the America entered the war. It's not right away, actually. That's a little inaccurate, but anyway. The passionate love of Americans for their America will have a lot to do with winning the war. It is an odd thing, though. The very patriotism on which we now rely is the thing that must eventually be in part relinquished if the world is ever to find a lasting peace and an end to these butcheries. To hold America in one's thoughts is like holding a love letter in one's hand. It has so special a meaning. Since I started writing this column, snow has begun falling again. I sit in my room watching the reenactment of this stagey old phenomena outside the window. For this picture, for this privilege, this cameo of New England with snow falling, I would give everything. Yet all the time I know that this very loyalty, this feeling of being part of a special place, this respect for one's native scene, I know that such emotions have had a big part in the world's wars. Who is there big enough to love the whole planet? Who is there big enough to love the whole planet? We must find such people for the next society. Although supernaturalism often seems hopelessly distant or impractical, supranationalism, there is one rather encouraging sign in the sky. We have lately at least one large new group of people to whom the planet does come first. I mean scientists. Scientists, however undiscriminating it has seemed in the bestowal of its gifts, has no disturbing club affiliations. It eschews nationality. It is preoccupied with an atom, not an atoll. There will be a showdown on supranationalism after this war. The bitter debate between isolation and intervention, a debate ended abruptly last Sunday morning on an island in the Pacific, was really an extension of the fundamental conflict between the national spirit, which is in practically everyone, and the universal spirit, which is in some but not in all. Before you can be a supranationalist, you have first to be a naturalist and feel the ground under you making a whole circle. It is easier for a man to be loyal to his club than to his planet. The bylaws are shorter and he is personally acquainted with the other members. A club, moreover, or a nation, has a most attractive offer to make. It offers the right to be exclusive. There are not many of us who are physically constituted to resist this strange delight, this nourishing privilege. It is at the bottom of all fraternities, societies, orders. It is the bottom of most trouble. The planet holds out no such inducement. The planet is everybody's. All it offers is the grass, the sky, the water, and the ineluctable dream of peace. Amen. Questions? Sorry, Roger Angell was Catherine's son from a previous marriage and stepson of E.B. White. They were very, very close. Roger Angell wrote some of the most beautiful things about E.B. White after he died. He also wrote a beautiful essay about 2 years ago about aging when he was only 90. And I have other quotes that I was going to use, but I just ran out of time. He's definitely the three of them are just mind-boggling. The genius of that family, yeah. Joel did read to E.B. White as he was dying, and he had some form of dementia, maybe Alzheimer's at the end. And Joel tells the story of sometimes E.B. White would say, "Who wrote that?" And Joel would say, "You did, Dad." And he goes, "Not bad." I think the recording wasn't actually made when he was reading to his father, but there's a beautiful recording of Joel reading his work, yeah. By the way, speaking of recordings, E.B. White recorded, I think he recorded all three of the children's books, but I know he recorded Charlotte's Web. And when he got to the part, spoiler alert, when Charlotte dies, they had to re-record it about 10 times because he kept crying. Isn't that amazing? You write this book, you spend years writing this book and still moved. The book is maybe the most famous of all children's books ever. Let me just, for those, have you all read it recently? Please run out and read it if you haven't read it in the last year. Every year, but it's so radical. Can I read a little bit of it? The opening chapter. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak and it will never amount to anything. So your father's decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father's right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with Father. And you remember this wonderful drawing from Garth Williams, who did the drawings for Stuart Little as well. They couldn't get him for Trumpet of the Swan. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself." Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Serious question. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his father with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing, a little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," said Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of." So this is quite a statement of animal rights. Rachel Carson was also a supporter of animal rights, but it was very controversial, and she didn't want to hurt her credibility around the chemistry, her fight with DDT. So she was very careful about that. But this is a profound statement, and of course the whole book continues that theme. What is the difference between a weakling child? No, it's wonderful. Do you know the play Wit? Does anyone remember the play Wit? It was a woman dying of cancer, and Lisa, what's her name? Lisa Harrow, I think, starred in it at Northern Stage. And anyway, there's one scene where she's a child, and she's reading Goodnight Moon, and her father's sitting there, and she goes, "What does this word mean, soporific?" And that word has been so wonderful word to me ever since I saw that play. I saw it about 10 times because I was on board at Northern Stage at the time. I got to keep watching. But it's so wonderful.
I think just, asking if you feel, as I do, that it's so important for these words to be in books for children.
Yes.
Because they need to build that vocabulary.
And to fall in love with words. How can, Dick and Jane, there were no words to fall in love with for years in my generation. Were there really? It's you have to fall in love with words. I tell my students, you can't write if you haven't read. You need to read because otherwise you're tone deaf. You're trying to write, but you've never heard any music. No, he was. No, they were not Unitarian. Vegetarian. Oh. Oh, that's good. Okay. I was going to launch into all the famous Unitarians, but no, he wasn't. He worried about that because he did kill the animals, and he raised animals in his farm and ate them. And he has one piece where a pig gets sick, and he goes to great lengths to save the pig, and he does. It dies, but he has this reflection about. He's tortured by it, but it was, I don't remember exactly, but it was quite a few years. The publisher was really frustrated. Stuart Little was first, and that took him quite a few years. And they kept wanting him to do it. And then, but Charlotte's Web was delayed. There was like 3-year delay when the publisher was really getting frustrated with him, and he just kept researching spiders. That was one of the big delays. It was at least a year delay just on that research alone. He had to get it right. He didn't want Charlotte doing anything that wasn't correct to her species. And he's like that with all the animals. He doesn't have any, other than speaking English. He doesn't have any, all his animals are true to who they are and well researched. The speaking English is very controversial, of course. There's a whole big thing about anthropomorphizing, but that's another lecture. But we anthropomorphize things so we can understand them because we're so self-centered. We can't understand anything that we don't anthropomorphize. I just think it's genius how he has animals speaking. I just think it. So, yeah, that's a good question. I have assigned Charlotte's Web. I did a course, so I teach mostly freshman writing these days, and I can change the subject whenever I want. So one term I had them do animals, and we started with Charlotte's Web, and then they each picked their own animal and researched it all term. That was really fun, but depressing because they're all going extinct. So I have them read Elements of Style. I don't have them read, now I'm thinking, why don't I? I'm glad you asked that question. You know, my life is so, there's so many threads that are all overlapping, but every once in a while, somebody comes and asks me a question, it's like, oh yeah, why don't I put that in that part of my life? Thank you, yes, I will assign an essay tomorrow morning, first thing. Which one would you recommend? The one that's anthologized is Once More to the Lake, of course. You probably all read it. It's a lovely piece, but I don't think it's his best by any means. I will pick one of these political ones, I think. Yeah. I've been trying to behave myself in the classroom. I'm really trying not to, yeah, well, I didn't even try last year, and then I got in trouble, so I've been trying to be polite, well, anyway. Yeah, that's a great idea. That will be, yeah, okay. Please read One Man's Meat. If you read nothing else, those essays are, that collection is just absolutely brilliant. You have it in the library, Cindy, right? You have all his work? What?
We have some.
I'm sure you have One Man's Meat. One Man's Meat. It's his collection of any of the, but as you say, I pulled from all his, not any of his poems, by the way. I think that's in the description, but the poems, it didn't quite make it. He never quite got off the ground in the poetry business. I mean, they're just too dated and corny. But I don't know any essayists. John McPhee, maybe. It comes close. But what other essayists anywhere near E.B. White? I just don't know him. Great question. What motivated E.B. White to write children's books? His wife, Catherine, was an editor of children's books, and so their bed was full of children's books that she was reading and deciding whether to review or not and commenting on. And so he got sort of interested in it. And then it might have been, I think it was Catherine, and probably Harold Ross suggested that because he has this, even in the adult essays, of course, he has this childlike openness and wonder and freedom of a child to see the present. You know, he's so immersed in the present. He's just totally there. That's why he can describe in such details what he was doing the day the United States declared war on Germany. You know, he was out in the barn and he was counting nails and he was doing this and he was doing that. That kind of presence makes for great children's writing, of course. Yeah. He was ambivalent at first, and he took forever writing Stuart Little, but then it was a huge success. I will read if you can. I will read the end of Stuart Little if you want me to do that, to wind us up, and it'll lift us up out of the political bog we're in. I have to tell you that Stuart Little, I was telling a friend of mine who is a distinguished, internationally known law professor, now retired from University of Michigan, my dear friend David. I was telling him a few years ago when I first started doing this E.B. White talk. And he said, E.B. White, he said, Stuart Little was my favorite book. And when I say goodbye to my law students, their last day of my last class I have them, I read them the last page of Stuart Little. Which has inspired me to do the same. Got the wrong book here. Cindy, do we have time for me to do this, or should I just send everybody home to read it? Okay. Well, do you remember he's on his way looking for Magala? I can never pronounce her name either. I don't know what's my pronunciation. Oh dear, I'm not sure. I don't have the right text, so I'm not sure where to start reading. Oh, he's talking to the telephone man. Do you remember this? Where are you going? And he's going, I'll just start here. Which direction are you headed, he asked. North, said Stuart. Oh, this is perfect for us. North, that's right. North is nice, said the repairman. I've always enjoyed going north. Of course, southwest is a fine direction, too. Yes, I suppose it is, said Stuart thoughtfully. And there's east, continued the repairman. I once had an interesting experience on an easterly course. Do you want me to tell you about it? He'd been going on and on and on before this. No thanks, said Stuart. The repairman seemed disappointed, but he kept right on talking. There's something about north, he said, something that sets it apart from all other directions. A person who is heading north is not making any mistake, in my opinion. That's the way I look at it, said Stuart. I rather expect that from now on I shall be traveling north until the end of my days. Worse things than that could happen to a person, said the repairman. Yes, I know, answered Stuart. Following a broken telephone line north, I have come upon some wonderful places, continued the repairman. Swamps where cedars grow and turtles wait on logs, but not for anything in particular. Fields bordered by crooked fences broken by years of standing still. Orchards so old they have forgotten where the farmhouse is. In the north, I have eaten my lunch in pastures rank with ferns and junipers, all under fair skies with the wind blowing. My business has taken me into spruce woods on winter nights where the snow lay deep and soft, a perfect place for a carnival of rabbits. I have sat at peace on the freight platforms of railroad junctions in the north, in the warm hours and with warm smells. This is a children's book, and children listen to this. They love it. I read Hamlet to my children when they were 10 and 5, and the 5-year-old was mesmerized. Never quite recovered, but... Sorry. One more paragraph. I've sat at peace on the freight platforms of railroad junctions in the north in the warm hours and with warm smells. I know fresh, this is the repairman still. I know fresh lakes in the north, undisturbed except by fish and hawk, and of course by the telephone company, which has to follow its nose. I know all these places well. They are a long way from here, don't forget that. And a person who is looking for something doesn't travel very fast. That's perfectly true, said Stuart. Well, I guess I'd better be going. Thank you for your friendly remarks. Not at all, said the repairman. I hope you find that bird. Stuart rose from the ditch, climbed into his car, and started up the road that led toward the north. The sun was just coming up over the hills on his right. As he peered ahead into the great land that stretched before him, the way seemed long, but the sky was bright, and he somehow felt he was headed in the right direction. Thank you very much.